Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'd like to welcome you back to another WSR live streaming session. Today, we're going to continue with our discussions on a variety of topics as we move through the next phase of the environmental assessment process after our terms of reference approval, big milestone. Every other week on Wednesdays at this same time, we will discuss a new topic and want to encourage you to provide as much input as possible by calling or texting us with your questions or comments. That number for calling or texting us is 1-844-424-0500. We are doing these radio shows and streaming sessions to help community members and the general public better understand what is involved in the federal impact assessment and provincial environmental assessment processes, and encourage viewers and listeners to participate in these two activities. With me today is my first co-host and a show pioneer, if I can say that, Mike, Michael Fox, he's also the project facilitator for the Webquay Supply Road project. Good afternoon, Mike, and welcome back to the host chair.
Yes, thank you. It's been a while, but I haven't done this for a while, so let's see how this unfolds.
No rust is apparent, Mike.
Right.
No rust is apparent. So, we don't have much time. We have a big topic to discuss.
Yes, we do.
And today's session is called Indigenous Knowledge Part 1. What is Indigenous knowledge? And as you would expect in a session like this, we're going to talk about Indigenous knowledge, how it's used in an environmental assessment, an impact assessment, and the Webquay Supply Road Indigenous Knowledge Program. So, Mike, we should get started.
Sure.
I'll do a quick run through of what we're going to cover today, very quick run through.
Okay.
We're going to talk about where we are now in the process, what IK is, Indigenous knowledge versus traditional knowledge, the different forms Indigenous knowledge can take, the importance of Indigenous knowledge in the assessment processes, ways Indigenous knowledge contributes to assessments, the community uniqueness of Indigenous knowledge and science interaction, and then wrap up with a discussion of the WSR IK program.
Ambitious.
So yeah, it's very ambitious, Mike, you're right. So let's dive in and start talking about Indigenous knowledge. Maybe you can kick things off by tackling a big topic. I'm glad I selected who gets to talk when. Yeah. So I'm going to let you try to tackle the challenging topic of what is Indigenous knowledge.
Indigenous knowledge. Yeah. So Indigenous knowledge is part of an emerging practice across Canada and probably elsewhere around the world, where you have professionals, interacting with Indigenous communities involved in environmental assessment process or impact assessment process. And so they're trying to collect and baseline what they call Indigenous knowledge. So there's no real one single definition. It takes different forms. It depends on who you're talking to. So if you, for the viewers, if you want to go to the federal agency, Impact Assessment Agency, they have a definition of Indigenous knowledge, but it's a regulatory one. But if you talk to community members, they have probably more deeper, meaningful views on what Indigenous knowledge is. I would say it's part of their worldview, it's part of the Indigenous people's worldviews, their cosmology. There's a sense of holistic, relational worldview with that as part. So it's not so much like Western science, I guess, where it's compartmentalized, right? It's discrete, like different
Objective, measurable, yes,
kind of thing. So it is a body of knowledge, built up over time with Indigenous communities, and it's always changing. There was a time where I guess might talk about it. Traditional knowledge was the term used before, and it signified that it's something in the past that we're trying to hang on to. But Indigenous knowledge really is cumulative. It grows with time and changes, with the environment, with the social and political changes, etc. So, yeah, so that's basically what Indigenous knowledge is.
Oh, thanks for that, Mike. And maybe I think I think you touched on it as well. This next slide, which is slide number 5. Um, you're right. Traditional knowledge was the term that was used previously, and but it probably has sort of gone sort of it's sort of become out of date, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because
Well, even with in the beginning, I mean, my first exposure to indigenous knowledge was in the forestry sector 20 something years ago, and it was based on changes in the legislation in Ontario, where they're required to collect native what they called native value collection,
yes,
which is a form of indigenous knowledge collection, and so it went from there in that sector to traditional knowledge. In other sectors, in other practices, to today's term, indigenous knowledge. So TK, traditional knowledge, is sometimes still used, and it's probably out of habit than anything else. But the proper term, I guess, these days is indigenous knowledge, because traditional has this historical connotation, like somehow it's in the past, it should stay in the past kind of thing. But indigenous knowledge is dynamic, it's present, it's evolving, and it's not set, frozen in time.
and Mike, just to add to what you were saying, 20 years ago, probably at the same time you were encountering it, my exposure to Indigenous knowledge was visiting communities, conducting interviews with community members with maps on the table and recording um, spatial boundaries,
Right.
right? Where are the berry picking areas? Where are the typical fishing areas? Where is the moose hunting done? And then I was a GIS person, and at the time we would take those maps back, digitize those maps, and then what you would do is you would add sort of buffers or uniform distances around these areas so that for one reason you could not pinpoint those locations, but also to sort of ensure that whatever the project was would not conflict with those areas. So
Yeah.
that and as we're going to get into as we go through this discussion, it's not just that anymore, is it?
True.
It never really was anyway, I guess, right? But so, Mike, IK is a very, very broad term, as you mentioned. Maybe you can take us through the different forms that IK can take.
Yeah. So, you know, uh, there's the more tangible
Yes.
elements. So traditional knowledge can be burial sites. It can be cultural landscapes or land features around a certain area, the harvesting locations, the spiritual significant sites that are out there, ceremonial areas where sweat lodge
Yep.
ceremonies are done, or in some cases, fasts are done, etc. Archaeological potential, in terms of formal villages or settlements that they knew from before, access and travel routes to these traditional sites in order to practice. And of course, there's hunting, trapping, fishing camps, cabins, and gathering teaching grounds. And the trend across Canada these days is sort of land-based activities. So it's really nice to see the elders and the youth, come together and transfer knowledge around the people's, the indigenous communities' homelands and stuff. The other two is the times of access to these traditional locations. So there's a seasonality, when it comes to some of these indigenous knowledge and um, land use, land and resource use
Yes.
type of thing. So how they collect this thing is there's different ways. Community surveys, uh, focus groups, and because it's not it's a discussion, it's an interaction with the knowledge holder,
Yes.
right?
It is.
Because there's sharing meaning, and I think I shared this with you before, where um, you're looking for a discrete answer to your question, but you don't get that. You actually get a story
Yes.
as part of their oral histories in the area. So you sort of have to, you plan out, that amount of time with the community members when doing Indigenous knowledge, and very interesting, and because the meaning, the significance, is sometimes tied to traditions, governance, and decision making.
Yes, and it's not a linear process, as I think you were talking
Yeah.
about, right? Like, as Western science people come in and sit down with community members and try to obtain that information, it isn't straightforward. In like you said, it's there's a lot of intangibles involved, and listening to those stories and gathering that and collecting that information is really important in being able to sort of effectively take that back and infuse that in your environmental assessment, right? In the different disciplines. So, that's, and we'll get into this a little bit later on. That's a bit of an art in its own right, and I think that's
True.
that sort of ties back in with what you're talking about with this evolving and emerging practice, right? This is a very sort of new area, and so let's move on now, Mike, to the importance of IK in the assessment process, because the role of IK in the impact assessment, in the environmental assessment process, has changed a lot
Yes.
in the last, very few years, like about 4 or 5 years, maybe. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, Mike.
So you're right. The changes are actually legislative changes. The legislation now makes IK, Indigenous knowledge, central to the process, the regulatory process. So they look at sort of the natural environment. Like it's sort of the IK feeds into different aspects of the environment in impact assessment. So the natural environment, the socioeconomics, the health, and it's expected to be included in the technical assessment, the effects assessment of potential project impacts on Indigenous communities. I think the ways IK contributes to the assessment process. So there's the collection of IK, and there's different methods in doing that. You mentioned one where you put a map on the table, and there's a small group of land users and knowledge holders, and there's other ways where it could be interviews.
Yes. Yeah.
And so there's different ways in collecting those information, and once that information is collected, it actually affects project design. I would say that Webequie Supply Road route was actually shaped by Indigenous knowledge. We sat with the land users and the traditional knowledge holders, and that's why it's sort of like wiggly.
Yeah.
It's not a straight line. So the initial part was just avoiding certain value components of the community, the valued aspects of it. So I would say Indigenous knowledge actually help contribute to the project design, help avoid certain areas, and then the baseline collection is used or as part of the whole thing. Again, it's this really clear distinction between this holistic worldview versus this sort of Western reductive, discrete, compartmentalized way of viewing the world, right?
Well, Mike, like when you talked about the Webequie community members coming up with that sort of preliminary corridor, right? The community preferred corridor. I mean, that was an exercise which we were involved in to a degree, but a lot of that was done by the community itself. It was an internal discussion, wasn't it?
It was.
And we don't necessarily know all the intricacies of that, but we know some of the factors involved in it, but we don't know all of the factors. But that was a group discussion, a number of group discussions over a period of time, wasn't it? Over a fairly lengthy period of time that resulted in that squiggly line, right?
Yes.
Which is
a lot of marked up maps.
That's right, exactly. So, and when we go back to talking about ways IK contributes to assessment processes, each VC has its own spatial boundaries. And you know, when you're talking about Indigenous knowledge of valued components or things that are important to community members, it's no different. It's no different whatsoever. So, and that's why it's important that we collect that information as part of this process, right? This environmental assessment and impact assessment process. Even things like temporal boundaries, Mike. I mean, we discussed this earlier today in the radio show, and I mean, Webequie has, you know, as a community, they have 6 seasons, not 4 seasons, right? And other communities might have a different number of seasons, or the seasons are defined in different ways because they live in different landscapes with different weather patterns, and so that's Indigenous knowledge right
true.
there. And then mitigation measures too, right? Potential mitigation measures. You know, that Indigenous knowledge can help shape what those mitigation measures might be, and then of course the follow-up and monitoring procedures, and I mean, Indigenous knowledge can help shape construction techniques, right? I mean, practices during construction, practices during clearing of vegetation. I mean, it can contribute to all aspects of a project, not just the planning phase, but also in the construction phase, the execution phase, and operations afterwards. So it plays such a vital role in sort of every aspect of environmental assessment. So the other thing, Mike, that I think it's important for us to talk about is the community uniqueness of IK. Every community is unique, right? Every community has its own Indigenous knowledge, and that occurs even within a community too, doesn't it, Mike?
Yeah. So how one community uses the lands or the waterways is can be completely different how another community uses it. It's even different within the community. So you may have one family or clan that uses the north end of the homeland, or you know, different from the south end of the homeland, or different families may harvest in different areas. So yeah, so IK is very specific to the community context. You know, how the coastal communities, you know, may view the world a bit differently than those inland, right? So it is very IK should reflect the community uniqueness.
Yes, yes, yeah. It's and I'm glad you mentioned that, from clan to clan, from family to family. So it's not just the community as a whole. Within that, you know, there is uniqueness in the Indigenous knowledge. I mean, some communities, some families within a community value certain species more than maybe other families in the community, because their traditional territory that their family has used might be different, right? It might have different composition of species of plants or animals, right? So, you know, different Indigenous knowledge. So, okay, let's move on now. Time's running short, so let's keep moving here and move on to a big topic. And this is a really interesting topic that's rapidly evolving, and that is the interaction between IK and what we call Western science, or science. Maybe Mike, you can talk a little bit about that.
Oh, that's a big one. Maybe you can put up the slide, our technician. So it's very hard to talk about this because they're so integrated. They're so embedded in each of the value components that are being studied. So we'll try. So when we do baseline studies, you know, we'll look at fish sites or locations. We'll look at the fish species, the different types of fish, fish health, you know, sampling the health, and the fish abundance. But we'll also talk with the indigenous communities about all those topics,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And how, you know, the cultural values or teachings that reflect around fish and fish habitat and stuff. So there's this inherent integration already that existed all along. It's just you know,
Yes.
the process didn't reflect it. Right?
No, it didn't. Yeah.
Now it's so embedded into the process that they make it what was implicit before, they're making explicit,
Yes, that's
right?
exactly it.
Um,
And the expectation is that it the indigenous knowledge basically feed each, all the studies that are part of an impact
yeah,
assessment, right, or environmental assessment. That's the expectation now. It can't just be a separate section on indigenous knowledge sitting alone. It has to be fully integrated with Western science. And this is by no means um, an established sort of and I guess, evolved approach, is it? It's very, very new, and people it's changing rapidly in terms of how that is done. I think is the best way to describe it. I would say um, it's not simple, like you said, because indigenous knowledge itself is not something that's highly objective, right?
yeah. I think you were there when the beginnings of this project, the WSR, and folks like Gordon
Yes.
were articulating the indigenous knowledge worldview, and so like Webbequay's principles in the integration of the provincial principles and the federal principles and the three-tier system, like that was a process in itself. And
Yes.
we were not even in the
That's
actual
right.
field studies and data collection phase. So just around the principles, it took a while for other folks and other parties involved to understand, truly what indigenous knowledge worldview is.
So true. So true. Um, just to keep our
Sure.
us moving, Mike, as time is running out, let's move on to a discussion of the Webequie Supply Road Indigenous Knowledge Program, because this is something that we started rolling out a couple of months ago, I think, Mike. Was it
Yeah.
something like that?
Yes, January.
And it's an important program. We need to collect, and we want to collect as much indigenous knowledge, indigenous knowledge as possible to ensure that this environmental assessment, this impact assessment, is as comprehensive as possible. We want to make this a robust evaluation of the project and impacts that the project may have. So maybe you can just take us through the key purposes of an IK program for an
Yeah.
environmental or impact assessment, Mike.
Yeah, for the WSR project, the Indigenous Knowledge Program is to develop an understanding of insights and knowledge gained from the experience, history, and traditions of Indigenous communities around the study area, and not just the tangible, but there is intangible, the meaning, the teachings around that as well. So IK will provide that opportunity. The IK program will also help identify potential effects of the project upon the Indigenous rights and interests within the study area. And then the other purpose is for WSR project team, to collaborate, work with the surrounding communities, Indigenous communities, to enhance the benefits or identify measures to avoid and reduce potential effects of Indigenous rights and interests. So it's important for Webequie, not because the study area is so close to their own community, but they understand that it's a wider area. There's
Yes.
some shared use. It's a big landscape.
And they view themselves as the stewards of their homeland.
Yes.
And that is, they take that role very seriously. And there's a federal impact assessment process, there's a provincial environmental assessment process, but there's also Webequie's process,
That's right.
right? And they have their own way of evaluating and then making a decision as to whether they want to proceed with the project. So, it's important. It's critical that we collect this information and integrate it to make sure, as I mentioned before, that we deliver a robust evaluation of the project. So maybe, Mike, now you can talk a little bit more about the program itself and sort of break that down a little bit.
Yeah. So so I believe Ontario's reached out to the other surrounding communities around the project area and offered capacity funding for the Indigenous Knowledge Program. Based on that assumption, the WSR team will take a collaborative approach to ensure that your community's values, the surrounding community's values and learnings are directly informing the decision-making process of the project. So we don't know what we don't know, and if there's no participation, then we have to go with what the existing
whatever we have,
whatever
we've been able to collect.
So it's best to get involved and share what you can so that we can mitigate, any potential effects. We also invite, I guess, the Indigenous communities to share as much Indigenous knowledge, land use information in a format that you're comfortable with, and the level of information you're comfortable with. We'll also engage your community to identify interests and scope of the Indigenous land use and study area and determine the appropriate study areas. And what we mean by that is that if it's more about the caribou, and then we'll look at the boundaries when he talks about spatial. When Don was talking about spatial boundaries, that means space, and temporal means time, like over time, seasons, years. Well, with study areas, we look at both dimensions.
Yes.
So if you're looking at caribou, and then it's looking at the caribou migration patterns. If it's water, and then likely the water stream, rivers and possibly the watershed. So we look at those things, whatever it is that's most important to the community, that we'll focus on those areas that we call value components, but that's just a fancy word of saying what's important, to the community.
Yes.
And we have confidentiality agreements, that when it comes to sharing specific things, and that's usually agreed to and signed prior to any collection and sharing of information. And then what's really new in the current legislation is that not only do we, collaborate and collect, but we have to come back and validate the Indigenous knowledge, land use information, and confirm that we have a firm understanding of it before weaving it into the environmental assessment report and impact statement. So your community has the opportunity to review the environmental assessment report and impact statement and provide feedback to ensure that the IK that was collected and then used within the report has been adequately and appropriately and respectfully integrated throughout the report. So we have a staff, Brianna's, that's sent out invitation letters to all the communities to participate in the Indigenous Knowledge Program. I think she's done follow-up a couple times to the leadership, but you can follow up with us as well. Don and I, you just go to WSR or supplyroad.com, contact page, and then you'll see our contacts if you're interested in participating in the Indigenous Knowledge.
Oh, thanks for that, Mike. And we covered a lot of territory in a short period of time, didn't we? That's a big topic, but this is only part one of our Indigenous knowledge discussion. There will be 3 parts. In our next session, 2 weeks from today at the same time, 4:30 p.m., we are going to talk about a challenging topic, which is integrating Indigenous knowledge into the environmental assessment and impact assessment. And I think what we'll do is we'll walk through maybe some examples just to help our viewers and listeners get a better idea of how that might be done. Again, it's evolving, right? But I think we should talk about that so they can see what the kind of thinking that goes on. And then on Wednesday, March 16th, 2 weeks after that, and 1 month from today, we will be doing another streaming session and radio show on Indigenous knowledge, the final part, and we will decide that mystery topic when it's time. So stay tuned. These are important discussions, and again, we are looking for Indigenous knowledge to incorporate in the environmental assessment and impact assessment for the Webquay Supply Road project. And that wraps up today's discussion, Mike. Thanks for joining me this week. Special guest,
That's good to
pioneer of live streaming for projects like this. And join us again in 2 weeks when we move to the second part of our discussion on IK. Don't forget to visit our site at supplyroad.ca or on social media via WFN Supply Road, Miigwech, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.